The mainstream media are preventing their own medical experts from accurately reporting on potential COVID problems. Meanwhile, they continue to repress information about vaccine efficacy. This is what happens when you politicize information and create a category called disinformation, which essentially gives you the opportunity to censor. Time for some truth. Hello there, you 6 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on this voyage towards truth and freedom. Importantly, individual freedom, individual ability to make choices for yourself based on a wide variety of sometimes opposing evidence and sometimes contradictory information that places you in the position as an adult to make decisions for yourself. That's not what the mainstream media want, but that's what we demand on your behalf. If you enjoy our content, please turn the notification bell on and subscribe right now, because the algorithm and indeed the mainstream are against us, but we have you as our fuel, as our weapon, as our purpose and our reason. That's what makes us strong. That is a claim that CNN simply cannot make, because ultimately CNN is a commercial enterprise that has partnerships that continually compromise them, and you only have to watch a little bit of their content to see these compromises in action. One of their own medical experts, Dr. Leana Wen, came on the show to discuss potential excess deaths and the complications of that, and CNN, because they have made the vaccine and coronavirus more broadly a political issue that is bipartisan and is attached to things like good and evil and rather peculiar and outdated ideas of ethics and morality, they can't have an honest and open conversation. They've tied themselves up in knots. Have a look at that conversation right now.
In a Washington Post op-ed, senior medical analyst and former Baltimore Health Commissioner Dr. Leana Wen asks, are some of these Americans dying from COVID or with COVID, dying from COVID or with COVID?
Do you remember when the phrase from COVID or with COVID used to be the same as saying, I believe that lizards from another dimension are running the government? Well, now it's just on CNN. This shows you how the conversation is advancing and changing, and how the mainstream media and the establishment continue to grapple with the problems that availability of information presents us with. But because it was politicized, because it was turned into an almighty bipartisan mind control bonanza, it's impossible to have an honest and open conversation. That's all we've ever advocated for. No one sees the world the same way. No one has the exact same set of criteria by which to live their lives. Therefore, we all need to just be given the information and make the decisions for ourselves. It should be no more controversial to make a decision based on what's best for you around certain medications than it is to say, I like tacos or I don't like tacos. What? You don't like tacos? It's people that don't like tacos that's causing all this problem now.
And she goes on to say, two infectious disease experts I spoke with believe that the number of deaths attributed to COVID is far greater than the actual number of people dying from COVID.
This was something that was discussed by people like Brett Weinstein. All these kind of things were out there from really early on. And I suppose that people that are naturally cynical, or skeptical at least, about the machinations of power, like myself, thought, I wonder if what this is this grants government the opportunity to regulate and control, Big Pharma the opportunity to make money, the surveillance industry the opportunity to surveil and propose ideas that digital ID that would never have been able to get off the ground without it, and these interests are converging. What I'm interested in is making evaluations based on available evidence, and the fact that that has now become marginalized as a viewpoint is really difficult, because information keeps coming out to suggest that all of the hysteria, this is a problem of the unvaccinated, if you're not vaccinated, you're responsible for other people being ill, all of this stuff, because it doesn't seem like it was true, is starting to fall apart, and people have alloyed themselves to these ideas beyond what they should have done as a news organization. News is not supposed to be politicized in that way. All of us have our biases, of course we do. But when you're in the role of a news broadcaster, particularly for a mainstream media organization, that's mass media, or let alone taxpayer-funded media in countries like mine, you have a responsibility to say, hey, this group of people think this group of people think that. We don't have a moral perspective on that, because it's not a moral issue. What they try to do is make it a moral issue by highlighting the areas where, if it were true, it could potentially be argued that it is moral, but that's all sort of fallen apart, hasn't it? So now we find ourselves in the position of having to extricate the politicization of this issue and pretending like it didn't happen. Well, it did happen. There's all of these shadows and echoes of the propaganda that went on in the last couple of years, and we're going to have to call it propaganda. People are having trouble letting go. They want to make it that, no, shit, I want to judge other people. You can't.
Can you explain why you believe COVID deaths are being overcounted?
I think it's important for us to be intellectually honest in this case, and that includes recognizing that circumstances have changed. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had a situation where there were many people dying from COVID pneumonia, including healthy young people were dying because of severe shortness of breath, difficulty breathing. They were hospitalized because of it. Then, as a result of vaccines and as a result of a lot of people getting COVID and having some level of immunity to it, we're seeing far fewer cases of that kind of severe COVID and severe COVID pneumonia specifically.
So the doctor appears to be saying that vaccines were to some degree effective, that natural immunity is effective, and that the problem simply isn't as bad anymore. But it seems that there's an ideological attachment to some of these ideas that never ought to have been ideological. It was a health and medical matter. This, I would argue, is one of the problems when science becomes a subset of capitalism. When pharmaceutical companies make more money from investing in their own stocks and shares, as Pfizer do, than making medical products. When pharmaceutical companies act as a monopoly with such an incentive for profit, with such a duty to their shareholders, and let's call it the systems of profit to which they are attached, there's almost a detachment from the actual purpose. What we are supposed to be doing is dealing with an illness. I suppose what we have to decide is if the cost-benefit analysis is coming down in our favour. Are lockdowns going to ultimately cause more harm than they prevent? Are these vaccines going to be beneficial to everybody or just a small group of society? What are the potential consequences of this new medicine being released on an unprecedented scale? These are all reasonable questions. If you asked these questions 2 years ago, you might as well have put on a buffalo hat, painted your face in the stars and stripes, and invaded the Capitol building. It was seen as a heresy. And heresy is the correct word, because once something takes on a kind of religious import, it denies reason and rational response. They look really upset, don't they, back in the studio? Lady in pale blue looking at the floor. Don Lemon getting pissed off. Brian Stelter, he's just off at Davos. Fuck this shit, Klaus, I'm coming!
And we need to give them the most accurate data possible so that they can better gauge their risks.
Most accurate data possible. Where's the heresy? Where's the problem?
Just a quick follow. You're not suggesting that hospitals stop testing people for COVID if they come in.
That's right. I think that there's a better way to do this. And actually, one of the people that I interviewed was Shira Duran. She and her colleagues came up with a different measure, which is using dexamethasone. So dexamethasone is a steroid that's used to treat cases of severe COVID.
Don Lemon's put glasses on. Next time he comes back, he'll be wearing a white coat, Pfizer badge.
And she and her colleagues found that in cases of hospitalizations that do not involve dexamethasone, it's very unlikely that the primary cause is COVID. So they're reporting both the total hospitalizations with COVID as well as the total hospitalizations with dexamethasone.
Powder blue touching it. Get this woman off the air! Yeah, I got Albert Boiler on the line. He is not happy.
And they found that about 30% of the current hospitalizations are actually for COVID, as opposed to 70% with COVID. So I think that's the kind of distinction that we need to be making.
So you're sort of saying that the mainstream media should tell the truth about the facts and let people decide for themselves. I don't like that.
That helps hospitals better gauge what's going on in their own system, and it allows people to understand their own risks a lot better too.
I talked to a lot of health officials about this who are actually kind of skeptical of this claim that you're making. And I think one big thing has been, what is the evidence?
Well, this is the reason why this kind of transparent reporting is going to be so important. There is a way for us to look at death certificates and also to look at the medical records of individuals prior to their death. And I think this needs to be separated into three categories. One is the COVID as a direct contributor, the primary cause of death. The second is, could it be a secondary contributing cause? So, for example, somebody with kidney disease, COVID then pushes them over the edge to have kidney failure. That's COVID as a contributing cause. And then the third is COVID as an incidental finding. So somebody coming in with a gunshot wound or a heart attack and they happen to test positive.
Biggie Smalls today was killed of COVID by Tupac. But because of cosmic COVID justice, he later himself got COVID and died.
That percentage would have shifted over time as well. In the beginning, probably a lot more people were dying with the primary cause of COVID. That probably has shifted. And I think, again, we need to understand this. Another reason to understand this, too, is a lot of people are wondering when they should get a booster next. When do we need a second booster or another booster? And the only way we can know for sure is to understand who is getting severely ill and when.
Plainly, this expert is not an anti-vaxxer. She's recommending vaccines during the report. She's just not recommending vaccines enthusiastically enough. That's what's happened now with the zeal, with the fervour, with the evangelicism around this ideal. It oughtn't be be so extreme. It's just some information.
But doesn't that change who should get boosters? Doesn't it depend on your age and your conditions that you have, preconditions, anything like that?
Yeah, it does. And that's what you should have said from the first place.
That's exactly right. And I think that's why we need to have this accurate accounting.
What's mad is them in silence, because it's like listening to people being told, you know what you've been doing for the last couple of years? Yeah. You went a bit over the top, didn't you? Uh-huh. You got a bit carried away, didn't you? Yeah. You thought you found a way of, like, hating people, didn't you? Yeah, we thought we found a way of hating people and that they couldn't do us for it because we was doing the right thing by hating people. Yeah, but you weren't, were you? No, we wasn't. We should have just said, this is a medicine. Either it works or it doesn't. Take it if you want it. But instead, we did the propaganda work of the pharmaceutical companies. Sorry.
If we find that the people who are getting severely ill are all individuals with certain underlying medical conditions, but not others, that allows us to better advise those individuals to take special precautions.
She's actually on her phone now. I'm not even listening to this. She's deleting her number from her phone. Dr. Leanne Wen. Delete, block.
I'm saying that we need to have better data so as to focus our attention on these people who are truly vulnerable and allow others who have put their lives on hold to maybe resume a lot of things that they might be too scared to do at the moment.
The case for objectivity becomes all the more apparent when you hear that continually studies are being released that question the efficacy of either vaccines or booster shots. And this is something that there can be a conversation around. You can't say, don't have that conversation, I don't like it stops people doing what I want. That's a form of tyranny. Some vaccine advisors to the federal government say they're disappointed and angry that government scientists and the pharmaceutical company Moderna didn't present a set of infection data on the company's new COVID-19 booster during meetings last year when the advisors discussed whether the shot should be authorized and made available to the public. Okay, so we're just discussing whether or not this profitable medicine should be authorized, one, and two, made available to the public so we can use their taxpayer dollars to buy it, therefore increasing the values of your product. What do you think we should do? I like what you just said, and it's all reasonable, and it's not like the vaccine's not effective or anything like that. No, what? Sorry, listen, could you put Don Lemon on the TV, see what he's got to say. That data suggested the possibility that the updated booster might not be any more effective at preventing COVID-19 infections than the original shot, or it doesn't do anything. The data was early and had many limitations, but several advisors told CNN that they were concerned about a lack of transparency. I was angry to find out there was data that was relevant to our decision that we didn't get to see, said Dr. Paul Offit, a member of the Vaccines and Related Biological Product Advisory Committee, a group of external advisors that helps the FDA make vaccine decisions. Decisions that are made for the public have to be made based on all available information, not just some information, but all information. Of course, if you just give people some information, that's a form of lying. That's lying by omission. That's manipulating the data. That's precisely what the mainstream media are being confronted with now. A lot of the stuff they broadcast was true. People are ill, people are dying, some medications are effective in some situations, but you can't just broadcast what's convenient to shareholders or to centralized establishment interests. That's a form of propaganda, and there is now a reckoning. The information is coming out, and now what we're being invited to do is just sort of forget about it and move on. It's being presented in a different light. We're supposed to just move past it. But I would suggest that there's a lot to learn from the way that the pandemic unfolded and the way that the media behaved and the way the establishment behaved and the way that we all behaved, perhaps, with regard to the conversation. And all that was ever required was openness and transparency. More than 6 months after the FDA advisors met, Moderna still has not released data from a randomized phase 3 trial comparing infections in participants who received the new booster with those who received the old shot. So presumably that information was not advantageous to their explicit agenda to make money. I mean, that's what Moderna is. It's not their fault, is it? That's what Moderna do. So clearly what's required is a massive address of the way that the medical industry behaves. Ultimately, what you want is clinical trials that are conducted independently. You don't want taxpayer money going to massive pharmaceutical companies. It fogs the mind. They can't think clearly anymore. If throughout this process it had been made clear that any profits would be returned to the public, returned to the taxpayers, then the whole thing would have been conducted a little more reasonably. The profit motive has driven people crazy. That's just my speculation. There's no evidence of that. Together, the new updated boosters from Pfizer and Moderna cost taxpayers nearly $5 billion. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of the annual budget for the state of Delaware. On that basis, money well spent. Just a joke, I've never been. A former FDA scientist who helped run the agency's vaccine division told CNN that if he was still at the agency, he would have advocated for sharing the infection information with the advisors, even if it was made available only a short time before the meeting. The company's failure to present this information at the FDA advisors meeting and the omission of discussion about the data at that meeting raises questions about the ability of the process to provide a full and transparent review of the data, he added. About a month after the CDC advisors met, studies were released from researchers at Harvard and Columbia suggesting that the new vaccines didn't work any better than the original. We essentially see no difference between the old boosters and the new about a month after the shot, said Dr. David Ho, a professor of microbiology and immunology at Columbia, whose team authored one of the studies. Basically, it's like the Matrix films. They should have stopped after the first one. President Joe Biden and other administration officials continue to emphasize that the updated booster is the best way to avoid hospitalization or death from COVID-19, but nearly 4 months after its release, only 15.4% of the US population aged 5 and older has opted to get the shot, according to CDC data. So presumably 85% of the population are skeptical about the information that they receive from their government and the mainstream media. And given that this booster cost $5 billion, I wonder what is causing this cynicism, and more importantly, how on earth do they continue to control the narrative so effectively? The CDC played a direct role in policing permissible speech on social media throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Confidential emails obtained by Reason show that Facebook moderators were in constant contact with the CDC and routinely asked government health officials to vet claims relating to the virus, mitigation efforts such as masks and vaccines. The Facebook files reveal that the CDC had substantial influence over what users were allowed to discuss on Meta's platforms, Facebook and Instagram. Meta gave the CDC de facto power to police COVID-19 misinformation on the platforms. The CDC took the position that essentially any erroneous claim could contribute to vaccine hesitancy and cause social harm. This was a recipe for a vast silencing across Facebook and Instagram at the federal government's implicit behest. How many of you felt the information was being silenced, that conversation was being shut down? Also, if Facebook is a de facto arm of the CDC, the idea that it's a private platform where users can have a conversation is a misleading, disingenuous and simply untrue one. It's ultimately a mouthpiece for a government agency. And obviously the Twitter files seem to reveal similarly that infiltration by a deep state organisation and other government bodies and indeed corporate interests, if not absolute, is somewhat substantial. And all of our experience around this issue demonstrate that that's exactly what has happened. That the thumb has been put on the scales, that one side of information was elevated, the other side was excavated and removed. That is not democracy. That is not freedom of speech. It's not open communication. It's not a conspiracy theory to ask questions, to have doubts, to demand access to all of the data, the right to make your own decisions, to speak freely about medical matters that should not have been politicized in the first place. It should never have left the domain of utility. You might want this thing, it might help, particularly it might help if you're in these categories. If you're in these categories, we've got some concerns about it. Obviously, it's up to you because we've not tested it on transmission, so it's just going to affect you ultimately. It's not a political matter. Whether you're a Trump person or a Biden person or you don't believe in any political organizations because they continually let you down because of their affiliations with big pharma, big tech, private finance, you might not trust any of them at all. Regardless, here are some facts. Good luck, do what you want to do. If they'd said that, I'd be out of a job. Really, all we're talking about is transparency, open, adult communication. Things are being needlessly politicized in order to create conflict so that people are confused and you can marginalize people and distract people. And importantly, that you are regarded by the powerful as a kind of big, hairy child that needs to be managed and governed, pacified and distracted rather than an autonomous, free adult. And if your entire culture and nation is built on freedom and liberty, individual freedom and the right to choose who you are and what you do as long as you're not hurting other people, then I think we're at a moment of great reckoning. And that is what people are trying to avoid. They're trying to avoid the fallout of the mistakes that were made during the pandemic. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. They're equally as good. Turn on that notification bell right now. That's what you can do immediately to ensure that you have access to truthful information. As soon as we get it, we'll give it to you. You can decide what's true. You tell us what to think. More important than any of that is that you please stay free.